All right, so most of what you're going to get today is a review. Using the scientific method, I'm sure, how many of you had to do science experiments at some point? In some elementary school, science fair, whatever. So everybody's used the scientific method, and they go over it with you every single year. It's like the first chapter of everything. It's the first chapter in chemistry. It's the first chapter in biology. But there are a few things that I want to specify with you. In particular, a lot of people forget like which variable in the experiment is the independent versus the dependent variable, what are controlled variables. Plus, some books use different names. Like I use independent variable, but I know sometimes some books will use manipulated variable. And dependent is sometimes called responding variable. So I want to clarify the vocabulary, make sure that we're all on the same page. All right, so this is already in your notes. This is the list of the basic steps that we use in the scientific method, right? You start with some kind of a question. You collect background information. You make a hypothesis. What do we always call a hypothesis? It's not just a guess. It's an educated guess, right? You've heard that before. You perform some kind of an experiment and collect your data. You analyze your data. You draw a conclusion. These are your basic steps. I don't think anybody in this room is staring at that going, I have never seen that in my life, right? Everybody is familiar with this. Okay, but here's the thing. How many of you have written if-then hypothesis? A lot of people. Awesome. So there's two kinds of hypotheses that you'll see in here. One of them is the if-then hypothesis. The other one is called a null hypothesis. Anybody ever had to write a null hypothesis? It's actually super easy. It's easier than an if-then, believe it or not. So I'm going to go through both types of hypotheses. We're going to practice with both types. And we're going to talk about defining the different types of variables in an experiment. And then that's when I'm going to hand it over to you guys and let you do some practice. So let's start with, this is just a sample experiment sort of out of the blue. Let's say your friend says they listen to music. It helps them study. You're wondering why your friend gets good grades. They're saying that it's because they listen to music and that listening to music helps them study. So how could you design an experiment that might test if music helps somebody study? What would be something that you could do? Just super simple. You can call out. Go ahead.
Would you like have someone who's like studying for a test and then test it? Like I'm listening to music and then they take the other side similar test and then they go do it.
Perfect. So you could get a person, have them study for a test listening to music, and then give them a study set that's similar in difficulty or whatever. Have them study for that without listening to music, have them take a test, compare the two grades. How could I do it if I was going to use this whole class? How might I do it? What could I do? Go ahead.
Use half the class, expose them to music, and the other half not, and then we'll take the same test.
Okay, so I could say, Friday we're taking the Chapter 1 test. Everybody on this side of the room, you're going to listen to music while you study. Everybody on this side of the room, you're not going to listen to music while you study. And then I compare the grades that everybody gets on the Chapter 1 test. What might be some of the issues I might encounter with that? Good. Some people study for way more time than others. Let's be honest. The sophomores are probably going to study way more than the seniors are for this test. You could also have different levels of ability. I mean, I don't know anything about you guys yet, so some of you may need to study a lot more than others to get the same grade on the test. What else might be an issue? If I just say listen to music, is everybody going to choose the same thing? What might happen there? There's different kinds of music. People who listen to death metal might not be as prepared for the test as somebody who listens to classical, or maybe pop, or rock, or country western, or whatever you choose to listen to. So there's a lot more to it, obviously, right, than just, they'll listen to music, they won't, and we'll just look at the grades and we'll have our answer. All right, so we've listed some experiments. So our hypothesis, let's just suppose that our hypothesis for the experiment, we think that listening to music, let's just say we're going to go with what our friend thinks, that listening to music is the reason that their grades are better. So we think that listening to music does help your grades for a test. All right, so two types of hypothesis. This is our first one, our if-then hypothesis. If, and then we're going to have a generality, and I'll show you what I mean by that in a second, then, and then it's our specific experimental results that we would expect to see. Now, let's say if I had assigned to you guys, and I told you, take 5 minutes and design the specific experiment that you're going to do to see if listening to music helps you study. Every single person in this room might come up with something a little bit different, right? I mean, some people might divide it by types of music. Some people might just look at the average test, average for each person at the end of the quarter. Some people might have everybody take the same test. Everybody might design something slightly different. However, the if part, this part right here, would be the same for every person in the room. If listening to music helps you study. That part, that's the generality. That's what we think in general. The then part would be specific to each person's experiment. So I have a sample one here. This is just one sample. So based on the experiment that I sort of came up with, here's our if listening to music helps you study better. So this is the part that would be the same for everybody. Then the students listening to music during their study time will perform better on the weekly test than those who listen to no music. Now this is very specific to the experiment that I thought of in my head. There's going to be one weekly test. One group's going to listen to music. Another group's not going to listen to music. If you came up with a slightly different experiment, then your then part would be a little bit different. Then the students who, like I said, maybe you're going to look at grades at the end of the quarter. Then the students who listened to music while they studied will have a higher GPA at the end of the quarter than the students who did not. That's a slightly different experiment. So the if would be the same for everybody. The then is a little more specific. It's telling me your specific experiment that you're going to do. So I know that my experiment, it's going to be the score on a weekly test, and I'm going to have one group listen to music while they study and another group not listen to music while they study. I'm going to pause that for a second. Okay, so that's our if-then. All right, now here's a null hypothesis. These are super duper easy. The null hypothesis basically says there will be no significant difference between the group that listens to music and the group that does not listen to music. A null hypothesis basically is a no difference hypothesis. Now you might say, well, that just sounds stupid. Why do you even do that? Here's the thing. If I say, I think listening to music will help your scores, and I have this side of the room and I control it really well. Everybody's the exact same intelligence and they study for the same amount of time and I try to control everything. And this group listens to music and this group doesn't. And the average test score on this side of the room is an 87 overall, with some higher and lower. And the average on this side is an 85 overall with some higher and lower. The question comes up, do I say listening to music helped? I mean, it was only 2% higher. Plus, we know that some scored higher and lower. I mean, that's an average. That's one piece of information. So here's the thing with the null hypothesis. If I say there will be no statistical difference, I'm going to show you mathematically a way to get a cutoff number, where we can plug in our data, get a cutoff number, and say, yes, there was enough of a difference between the two groups to say statistically listening to music helped, or no, the two groups were so similar, it's not enough of a difference, even though on paper, yes, this was 2% higher average, it's not enough to say that it was statistically significant. So the great thing about a null hypothesis is that mathematically, we can actually come up with a cutoff number and say yes or no. Whereas with an if-then hypothesis, we might now, obviously, if this side gets an average test score of 90 and this side gets an average test score of 65, that seems pretty obvious. I mean, almost everybody would agree, wow, a 90% versus a 65%, it definitely seems like the music helped. But where do you cut it off? If it's an 85 versus an 87, or an 80 versus an 83, or an 80 versus an 85, each person in this room might say, I'm not sure if that's enough to say music really made that much of a difference, that it would really be worth it, that I'm going to totally do so much better. So that's the purpose of a null hypothesis, and we'll get to the statistics part of a null hypothesis later. But that's basically how a null hypothesis works. Any questions on a null hypothesis? Like I said, it's easy. It's easier than the if-then. If-then's actually a bit more difficult to structure. This is easy. Yes?
Is there a specific cutoff?
There will be, and what you'll see is on the formula sheet that you'll actually see those cutoff numbers. You won't even have to memorize them or anything like that. And I'm going to show you how to draw what are called error bars on the graph. It was actually on the pretest, like the last question had these little eye-shaped error bars. You'll actually be able to look at those error bars, and when error bars overlap with each other, it means there's no statistical difference. So you could look at the averages, you could have something like this, like where you have, let's say, these two averages, and these are the error bars that I'm talking about. If these error bars overlap with each other, we actually would say there's no statistical difference between the two groups, because it actually means that this, even though this was the average I calculated, the real average lies somewhere in here, which means it could technically be as high as this, and this average could technically be as low as this. So statistically, we would say there's really not a difference, whereas if you had this, and these little teeny tiny error bars, this would be a statistical difference. These little error bars don't overlap with each other. So I'm going to show you numerically how to calculate the number of how to make that error bar bigger or smaller, and then how to read one when they give you error bars to determine if there's enough of a difference. But that's the ideal reason why we use a null hypothesis. So does that make sense of why a null hypothesis is a little more significant? All right, awesome. The lack of response is fantastic. Moving along. All right, so we're going to run through the parts of a controlled experiment. Most of this should also sound very familiar to you. First one, independent variable. Some books call this the manipulated variable because you are in control of changing it. So what would be the independent variable in our music experiment? Yes. Right, whether we let them listen to music while they study or they don't listen to music while they study. That would be our independent variable. And I'll jot it off to the side here. So in this case, music versus no music. That was our independent variable. That was the thing that we were controlling. We can also break this down into our experimental group, which is the group that receives the change. In our experiment, obviously, that would be the group that is listening to the music. And what do we call the group that doesn't get the change? Right, that's our control group. They should be the same as the experimental group in every other way except for that one variable. Because if I have a group listening to music and the other group doesn't, but the group that's listening to music also happens to be seniors, and the group that doesn't listen to music is sophomores, and one group studies for longer periods of time, then I don't know for sure that the music was the reason. So the control group should be exactly the same as the experimental group in every other way. The only difference would be that one variable is going to be changed for them. They're not going to receive whatever the treatment is. And then our last one here, our controlled variables. These are going to be the things that we want to be the same. So we mentioned, for example, that one good thing we could do is we could have the same level of student. We also mentioned that the tests they take, they would all take the same test at the end. We mentioned study time, that we would want to make sure that they all study for similar amounts of time. So all of the things that we would want to be the same for everybody to make sure that it was indeed music versus no music, that led to our change. Can you read that? Sorry. Same level of student, they take the same test at the end, and the amount of study time they're given is the same. So those are just a few examples. You could get more and more specific. People start getting really crazy. But we'll only test girls, and they're all 14, and they're all in the same class at the same period, and they ate the same thing for breakfast. I mean, you could go nuts and get really, really specific, but all the things you want, you want to keep it as similar as possible. All right. And then that brings us to our dependent variable. And there can actually be more than one. That's your data. In this case, it was going to be the grade that they received on the test. If you were doing a different experiment, it might be their GPA at the end of a quarter. If you were measuring the effect of fertilizer on plants, what might be some things you measure to determine if the fertilizer was helping them? What specifically would I look for? Growth, so I can look at the height of the plant. Now, what if my plants are really, really tall, but they're skinny and they have tiny leaves? That may not be great, right? What else might I look for? The condition of the plants. If I'm a florist, what am I most interested in? Yeah, I'm much more interested in if the fertilizer makes them have more flowers, if the leaves are greener. So it could be the speed of growth. It could be the number of leaves they have. I think I actually listed a few of them here for you. So fertilizer on plants, I didn't list them, I just put the question. It could be how quickly they grow. It could also be the color of the leaves, the condition of the plants, the number of flowers they produce, how colorful the flowers are. There could be lots of dependent variables.